If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Robert DeBernardo was a captain in the Gambino crime family, who was reputed to control much of the commercial pornography in the United States. During the 1984 U.S. presidential election, publicity about DeBernardo having rented business premises from the husband of Geraldine Ferraro embroiled her in damaging media innuendo about organized crime. By some accounts, DB was the most dominant figure behind the U.S. adult industry in his era. He was a relatively capable businessman who did not have a reputation for involvement in violence, but his mafia links deterred potential competitors and warded off other criminals. He became immensely influential in the pornography business and an associate of Reuben Sterman. Whether DB's relationship with Sterman and others was based on extortion or mutual advantage was never established. He was seen as a phenomenal moneymaker, secretive, and a lone operator. Unlike most mafia members of his status, he did not retain a crew to back him up. All of these traits made him vulnerable to others within Gotti's organization. DB, who had been the target of a federal investigation into child pornography, was awaiting sentencing when he was murdered by members of Sammy Gravano's crew on orders from John Gotti. The body was never found. According to some accounts, Angelo Ruggiero engineered an order from Gotti to kill him because he had once told Ruggiero that he was not smart enough to be underboss. One of the relatively few thought to have become made in the mafia without committing a murder, DB, at that time devoted to the De Cavalcante crime family, bought the softcore pornography business Star Distributors in the late 1960s and used it to sell hardcore pornography of all types and media to adult industry businesses around Times Square. To many, the proliferation of such businesses in the early 1970s made the area a symbol of the city's decline. By the mid-1970s, hardcore pornography was being openly sold in New York and other U.S. cities, sparking outraged calls for the banning of all pornography and drawing police attention to DB. These films were imported, usually from Denmark or the Netherlands, and were viewed in peep show booths. He became associated with the Gambino crime family through his acquaintanceship with fellow pornographer and Gambino captain Ettore Zappi. Zappi allegedly sponsored DB for membership in the Gambino family. DeBernardo directly commissioned the production of much of the so-called golden age of porn-era hardcore films made in New York. Rivals were intimidated out of business or co-opted into his network. Independents, such as the San Francisco-based Mitchell brothers, who were immune to pressure due to their location or other reasons, had their films pirated. In his relationship with the largest porn seller in the United States, Reuben Sterman, it is unclear whether DB was extorting or collaborating. However, FBI bugs caught him telling another pornography magnate, Michael Thevis, that the family was in charge of his businesses. DeBernardo and his associate Theodore Teddy Rothstein, the co-owner of K-Ed Productions Inc. with DB, were among 44 people indicted as a result of an undercover FBI investigation of all major publishers and distributors of adult films and magazines throughout the United States, which began in 1977. DB became the prime target of the operation following the death of Michael "Mickey Z" Zaffarano, a Bonanno crime family captain who suffered a fatal heart attack as FBI agents served a warrant for his arrest at his Times Square adult movie theater on February 14, 1980. Bernardo and Rothstein were convicted in Miami of conspiracy, transporting obscene materials for the purpose of sale and distribution, and 3 counts of using a common carrier to transport obscene materials across state lines on June 12, 1981, and each sentenced to 5 years in prison. A federal judge then overturned the convictions of DeBernardo and Rothstein and ordered the indictments against them dismissed on grounds that FBI agent Patrick Livingston, who posed as a dealer of adult materials in Miami, and purchased allegedly obscene films and videotapes from KED Productions may have lied to a grand jury. Livingston was arrested for shoplifting in November 1981, and there was evidence he was experiencing psychiatric problems involving an inability to distinguish between his real and undercover identities. Although ostensibly only ranking as soldier in the Gambino crime family, he reported and paid financial tribute directly to Paul Castellano. DB complained that he got little respect from Castellano, who despised the porn business, but that Castellano took a hefty percentage of the returns nonetheless. One of the first to support John Gotti's plot to kill Castellano and supplant him as boss, Robert DeBernardo was rewarded with the status of captain, despite not heading a crew of his own. New York police routinely surveilled DB as an organized crime figure, but he only became widely known after his name emerged in publicity surrounding the 1984 Democratic candidate for United States Vice President. The Walter Mondale campaign drew attention shortly after choosing Geraldine Ferraro for the ticket when the personal finances of Ferraro and her husband, real estate developer John Zaccaro, were made an issue, and it emerged DeBernardo rented his premises from Zaccaro's company. The issue removed early momentum the Mondale-Ferraro ticket had gained and diverted the campaign. DB was not mentioned during the 1984 vice presidential debate, though questions over Ferraro's separate tax filing, which were widely seen as carrying implications about her husband's business, put her on the defensive. The Mondale-Ferraro ticket, always a heavy underdog, lost the general election. In 1992, the now-deceased Dibernardo was brought up with more effect to discredit Ferraro, seriously damaging her fortunes in a Senate primary that she had been frontrunner for. Sammy Gravano said he was told by the only mafia member allowed to see John Gotti in jail, his friend Angelo Ruggiero, that Gotti wanted DB killed for being subversive. In his memoir, Gravano said he was reluctant to obey the command, failing to understand how DB, without the soldiers that would be necessary for any power play, could or would be posing a threat to Gotti's leadership. Born in the Lower East Side section of Manhattan, Steven Gramada was a drug trafficker by the early 1930s. In the late 1940s, he became a full member, or made man, with the Mangano crime family, later known as the Gambino family, under its founder and boss Vincenzo Don Vincent Mangano. In 1951, with the disappearance of Vincent Mangano and the murder of his brother Phil Mangano, also in 1951, then Captain Albert Anastasia became boss. A former head of Murder Inc., Anastasia was one of the most dangerous and murderous mobsters in New York. He promoted another captain after the murder of previous underboss Frank Scalise, Carlo Gambino, to be his underboss. During this period, he worked in a crew with brothers Joseph, Joe Piney Armone, and Stephen Armone. In 1957, the other New York City crime families started questioning Anastasia's leadership. He had reportedly been murdering innocent people just because he felt like it, as he once ordered the murder of a tailor he saw on television, just because the tailor had been robbed and reputedly was filing his report. Other mob bosses such as Don Vito Genovese, and Tommy Lucchese and Meyer Lansky eventually had enough of Anastasia. In 1957, Gambino ordered Joseph Joe the Blonde Biondo and Stephen Armone to murder Anastasia. Stephen reportedly included his brother Joseph on the hit, but Joseph had been arrested on drug charges. Stephen then replaced Joseph with Gramada. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Anastasia entered the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel, now the Park Central Hotel, in Manhattan. As Anastasia relaxed in the barber chair, Steven Gramada, Arnold Wittenberg, and Stephen Armone rushed in, shoved the barber out of the way, and started shooting. The wounded Anastasia allegedly lunged at his killers, but only hit their reflections in the wall mirror. Anastasia died at the scene. After Anastasia was killed, Profasi crime family mobsters Carmine Jr. Persico and Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo claimed credit for the murder. Gramada and his two associates were never seen as the real killers. No one was ever arrested or tried for the murder of Albert Anastasia. In 1965, Steven Gramada and Joseph Armone were convicted of smuggling heroin into the United States from the Netherlands and received 8-year prison sentences. In 1970, both men were released from prison, and Armone was promoted to captain of his brother's old crew. Gramada spent the next 25 years as a soldier in Joseph Armone's crew. After Gambino's death in 1976, his brother-in-law Paul Castellano became family boss. Castellano soon became enmeshed in a rivalry with Captain John Gotti. Gotti had a poor relationship with Steven, as he considered him to be a dangerous rival. When Gotti organized Paul Castellano's assassination and became the new Gambino boss, his shot of becoming promoted was in doubt. However, John was convicted of murder within the RICO Act and sentenced to life in prison. With Gotti in prison, Gramada finally became a captain in 1994, taking over Jack Giordano's crew. He was named to a ruling committee panel to assist acting boss John Jr. Gotti in running the family. Steven sat in and contributed as acting boss on the Gambino ruling panel from 1996 to 2002, when it was disbanded after John Gotti's death. He then went back serving as captain. In the mid-1970s, Joe Gelsia became a made man in the Genovese family by killing Genovese mobster Carlo Colli Di Pietro. Di Pietro had been a partner of both Gelsia and future Gambino boss John Gotti in a Queens flea market. During this time, Joe and Larry Gelsia earned a reputation as a huge moneymaker by moving his family into the extremely lucrative gasoline bootlegging rackets. While never attaining a position within the administration, Gelsia became a very influential and wealthy mafioso who occasionally answered directly to Vincent Gigante and his uppermost family members, often going over his captain's head. Joe Gelsia maintained interests in several Queens and Long Island produce companies as well. Joe and his brother Larry ran construction schemes, loan sharking, and extortion rackets in Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Long Island. In the early 1980s, Larry went to federal prison for supervising a credit card fraud scheme. The Gelsias also engaged in criminal activities with Genovese gangsters Rosario Gangui, Alphonse Ali Shades Malangone, and Rudolph Rudy Cuball Izzy. The gasoline bootlegging rackets were originally conceived by Russian mobsters. However, the Russians needed the cooperation of the New York Mafia 5 families to continue their business. Gelsia's operation was run by Russian mob boss Murat Balagula and his associates Igor Roizman, Igor Paratsky, and Sheldon Levine. The mobsters would set up shell companies to distribute gasoline at a price fraudulently represented as including federal, state, and local excise taxes. Naturally, the mobsters would in fact pay no tax on such sales. Should the operation be uncovered by the authorities, the shell companies would simply be closed and others opened. Another major figure in the gasoline racket scene was Colombo crime family captain Michael Franzese, a friend of Joe Gelsia. In 1986, Joe and 6 others were charged with evading over $11 million in taxes. All the defendants were eventually convicted or pleaded guilty, and all went to federal prison. In 1989, while in prison, Joe Gelsia was suspected by federal investigators of ordering the murder of Michael Markowitz, a Russian gangster. Markowitz was shot dead in Brooklyn by Joseph Reich. Gelsia would be indicted again on similar charges in 1991. An investigation by the New York State Governor's Office reported that the New York 5 family's bootlegging scheme avoided taxes on 1 out of every 10 gallons of gasoline brought into the metropolitan area. The report stated that gasoline bootlegging had become the mob's most profitable scheme. In being one of the Genovese family's first point men in the gasoline bootlegging racket, Gelsia was involved in the setting up of a council of mobsters that decided which wise guys and families had the rights to which companies and profits. Other wise guys involved in the operation included Genovese soldier Danny Pagano, based in the Bronx and East Harlem, Gambino Captain Anthony Fat Tony Morelli, based in Staten Island, Gambino soldier Gennaro Jimmy Sweats Della Monica, Morelli Staten Island crew, Lucchese family underboss Anthony Gaspipe Casso, who testified before Congress about the mob's involvement with the Russians, Colombo Capo Victor Orena, Jr., son of the family's former acting boss, Colombo soldiers Frankie the Bug Ciortino and Joseph Audino, both Orena crew members. Joseph Gelsia's brother Lawrence Larry Glitz Gelsia is a Genovese soldier. Joseph Gelsia's son Lawrence, a Genovese associate, was arrested in 2001 on federal loan sharking charges. Former Gambino underboss Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano testified that at Gelsia's son's wedding in the early 1990s, a sit-down was held between Gambino boss John Gotti and Patriarca crime family captain Junior Russo to avoid a shooting war with the family's new boss, Raymond Patriarca, Jr.